February 13th, 1981. The sky above the Bekaa Valley is a sharp, almost unreal shade of blue, the kind of thin, brittle color that exists only near the edge of space. At 65,000 feet, the air is so thin it can no longer sustain human life without bulky pressure suits that resemble astronaut gear more than traditional flight uniforms. From this altitude, the curve of the Earth is unmistakable. Up here, the world feels silent and detached. For the Syrian Air Force, operating under the vigilant supervision of their Soviet advisors, this altitude isn't just advantageous, it is sacred. It is a literal refuge built from the laws of physics themselves. Inside the cockpit of a MiG-25, the pilot feels a vibration that is less a tremor and more a deep, resonant hum radiating from raw, unrestrained power. He is strapped in to the Foxbat. To Western analysts, the Foxbat is a terrifying mechanical beast. To the Soviets, it is a technological triumph incarnate, an uncompromising brute built for one purpose: unmatched speed. Constructed from stainless steel and titanium and powered by enormous Tumansky engines that devour fuel faster than a fire consumes paper, the MiG-25 is not meant to maneuver gracefully or dogfight. It is built to outrun anything that dares approach it. And for almost 10 years, nothing in the Middle East has come close. Far below, in a fortified command bunker carved into the Syrian hillsides, smoke from dozens of cigarettes clouds the air, while Russian and Arabic voices murmur over the drones of equipment. Radar screens glow with sweeping green arcs. Soviet Colonel Valery and his technical team stand behind the Syrian operators, arms folded, their faces showing complete disinterest. They have watched this scenario unfold many times. Another routine provocation mission. The strategy behind it is brutally simple and almost impossible to counter. A Syrian MiG-25 races to Mach 2.5, darts across the Israeli border, triggers every alarm from Tel Aviv to Haifa, and then races back to safety before Israeli jets can intercept. It is a deadly game of tag played by an aircraft faster than artillery shells. Targeted altitude, speed Mach 2.3, a Syrian controller reports evenly. The Soviet advisor merely nods. He glances at his watch. The Israelis will scramble, he says, his voice dripping with boredom. Let them burn their fuel. They can't touch him. On the radar screen, the MiG-25's return blip streaks across the display with haunting velocity, an apparition that appears, threatens, and disappears. At 20,000 feet, the radar picks up the Israeli response. 2 F-15 Eagles climbing through the haze. The Eagle is a masterpiece of American aviation, a symbol of Western air superiority. But the laws of physics do not care about reputations. To intercept a target moving at Mach 2.5 at 60,000 feet, a fighter must either be faster or be above it. The F-15 is neither. Colonel Valery watches the engagement geometry develop on the display. He sees the F-15s clawing upward, bleeding energy with every second. He smirks. They're trying a snap-up, a complete waste of missiles. High in the stratosphere, the Syrian pilot's warning receiver emits a lazy chirping tone, Israeli search radar tracking him. He looks down, but sees no jets, only tiny specks lost in the distant landscape far below. He feels untouchable. He shoves the throttles forward, lighting the afterburners. The MiG-25 shudders violently as it punches deeper into the transonic envelope, accelerating toward Mach 2.8. He is now moving faster than the sound of his own engines. But then the tone changes. It does not escalate into the frantic scream of a typical missile lock. Instead, it shifts instantly into a firm, unwavering tone, indicating a lock, but one that makes no sense from the engagement geometry. In the bunker, The radar still shows the F-15s thousands of feet below, climbing steeply but running out of momentum. According to every Soviet simulation and wind tunnel test ever conducted, the American Sparrow missiles cannot possibly reach this altitude with enough energy to maneuver. If launched, they should burn out and tumble harmlessly back to the ground. "They've fired," a Syrian operator shouts, disbelief cracking his voice. The Soviet advisor frowns and leans closer. "At that angle? Impossible. A bluff shot. Tell the pilot not to turn. Turning bleeds speed." The order is transmitted. Maintain heading. Ignore the launch. They are out of range. On the radar screen, the MiG-25's return blip streaks across the display with haunting velocity. An apparition that appears, threatens, and disappears. On the radar, the MiG-25's return blip streaks across the display with haunting velocity. An apparition that appears, threatens, and disappears. On the radar screen, the MiG-25's return blip streaks across the display with haunting velocity. An apparition that appears, threatens, and disappears. On the radar screen, the MiG-25's return blip streaks across the display with haunting velocity. An apparition that appears, threatens, and disappears. The Syrian pilot trusts the calm voice in his ear. He trusts Soviet engineering. He trusts the numbers. He keeps the nose level, waiting to break off and head home, amused by what he assumes is another futile Israeli attempt. Then the sky detonates. There is no visible missile trail, no warning streak, just a catastrophic blast that tears open the MiG-25's right wing. Traveling at nearly Mach 3, the aircraft instantly comes apart, scattering metal across the upper atmosphere. The cockpit whirls violently. G-forces slam the pilot against the canopy as the world fades into gray. The invincible fortress of steel has been obliterated by a weapon that, according to every Soviet manual, should not have been able to reach it. In the bunker, the radar blip does not decelerate or turn. It simply blossoms into a cloud of static and disappears. The sweeping green line passes once, twice, nothing. A heavy silence descends. Smoke hangs motionless in the air. The Syrian operator taps the radar glass, hoping the screen is malfunctioning. He looks at the Soviet advisor, eyes wide with dread. Target lost. Contact gone. The Soviet colonel stares at the empty patch of radar. His mind races. Engine failure? Structural collapse? A meteor strike? Anything except the unthinkable. It could not have been an Israeli missile. It could not have been the F-15s. They were too far below. They were too low. They were too slow. "Pull the tracking logs, now!" the colonel snapped, his voice cracking with agitation. "I want the telemetry immediately. Was there a mechanical failure?" The operator fumbled with the controls, replaying the radar data. "Sir, the American radar lock was steady, and the missile's velocity profile, none of it fits our models." This was the moment the balance of the Cold War quietly shifted, long before anyone in Washington or Moscow realized it. This was the moment the ghost died. If you're enjoying this deep exploration into the hidden battles of the Cold War, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We bring you the stories history books forgot. The turmoil in the bunker wasn't simply about losing a pilot or an airframe. It was about losing a belief system. For 2 decades, Soviet air doctrine had been built on a single unshakable principle. Speed and altitude meant survival. They were convinced that flight above 60,000 feet made an aircraft untouchable. The MiG-25 had been created to answer American threats, an aircraft engineered to terrify the West. Yet, on this February morning, that certainty dissolved into a trail of burning debris over the Lebanese mountains.
The Soviet advisors reacted instantly. Contain the information. This could not be allowed to spread. If the Syrians realized the MiG-25 could be shot down, morale would implode. If the Americans confirmed what they had accomplished, they would be emboldened. It was a fluke, the colonel insisted, pacing the cramped room. A lucky hit, pure chance. The pilot must have descended. He must have broken protocol. A narrative of pilot error began to form. They blamed Syrian training. They blamed maintenance crews. They blamed anything except the unthinkable truth, that the Americans had somehow managed to hit an aircraft flying at the edge of space. But as the days passed, the analysis grew darker. The radar tapes were flown to Moscow under armed escort. Engineers and intelligence analysts dissected the grainy data frame by frame. They examined the F-15's climb profile. They studied the missile's trajectory. Nothing made sense. The F-15 had launched its missile from an extreme lookup angle that should have confused its own radar. Terrain interference from the mountains should have blinded the missile seeker. And though the MiG-25 was a perfect visual target against the clear blue sky, electronically it should have been hidden by the Earth's background noise at such a steep angle. And then there was the missile itself, the AIM-7F Sparrow. The Soviets knew this missile well. They had stolen its design long ago. They knew its burn time. They knew its maximum reach. Based on the geometry of the engagement, the missile should have lost fuel halfway to the target. It should have tumbled uselessly back to Earth. Instead, it climbed, tracked, and killed with surgical precision. A phantom missile, one Moscow analyst wrote in a classified assessment. Either that, or the Americans have rewritten the rules of physics. Paranoia swept through the ranks. Had the Americans developed some exotic new propellant? Were the F-15s using a classified laser guidance system? Was there an invisible drone directing the strike from above? GRU headquarters demanded answers. They needed to identify the weapon that had slain the Foxbat. Because if the MiG-25 could be killed, then so could the MiG-31. And if the MiG-31 was vulnerable, then the massive northern frontier of the Soviet Union, dependent on these high-altitude interceptors, was suddenly exposed. American B-52s and the rumored B-1s could slip over the Arctic and strike at will. The implications were cataclysmic. The destruction of that single MiG-25 in the Baikal Valley was not a minor skirmish. It was a strategic earthquake. It proved that the technological gap the Soviets believed they were narrowing had abruptly widened into an abyss. Back in Syria, unease grew among the pilots. They stared at the MiG-25s on the tarmac, heat shimmering above their monstrous engines, and saw not a shield, but a tomb. "They can see us," a Syrian major murmured to a Soviet advisor days later. "We're at 60,000 feet, and they're locking on. How? How are they doing it?" The advisor had no answer. All he could do was repeat the same orders. Climb higher, fly faster. Push it to Mach 2.8. If the engines burn out, so be it. But doubt had already taken hold, and the mystery only deepened. Reports from other sectors began to surface. Strange electronic disturbances, radars momentarily going blind, unexplained interference. The ghost was gone, but something even more unsettling had taken its place. It felt as though the Israelis had perfect knowledge of everything the Syrians did, when their aircraft lifted off, where they were headed, and exactly how to intercept them. It was as if the Americans were inside their briefings, or worse, inside their computers. Soviet advisors began suspecting treason. They ripped apart the Syrian command hierarchy, searching for infiltrators. Technicians were interrogated. Encryption codes were changed daily. But the ghostly encounters persisted. The F-15s always seemed to be waiting, perfectly placed, as if following a script written before the battle even began. The incident on February 13 was only the first shot in what would become a slaughter that would reshape air combat doctrine. But at that moment, all anyone felt was the raw shock of the impossible. The MiG-25, the fastest operational fighter in the world, had been swatted out of the heavens like an insect, and the Soviets were utterly clueless as to how. The remains of the MiG-25 were strewn across a remote stretch of the anti-Lebanon mountains, a mess of charred titanium and scorched circuitry. Reaching the crash site was hazardous for the Syrian recovery teams. For the Soviet specialists, getting there was non-negotiable. They needed the flight recorders, the only tools that could shed light on the unthinkable. But the electronic investigation had already begun in a sealed room in Moscow. The GRU seized control of the inquiry. Their attitude was not of scientific analysis. It was fear-driven triage. The Soviet Air Defense Network, the protective shield of the motherland, used the very same systems found in the MiG-25. If Israel could pierce it, NATO could do the same. General Arkady, a senior analyst of Soviet air defense systems, glared at the telemetry printouts scattered across a long oak table. The room smelled of old coffee and quiet panic. "Look at this energy spike," he said, jabbing a thick finger at a jagged line. "The Israeli radar didn't simply lock, it cut straight through. It held the lock through the notch." This was the heart of the mystery. Radar in the 1980s depended on Doppler shifts. To be tracked, an aircraft needed to move in a direction that created a detectable frequency change. If it flew perpendicular to the radar, a maneuver known as notching, it became invisible, blending into the background clutter of mountains and terrain. This was a standard Soviet escape maneuver. The Syrian pilot had executed it. He should have vanished from the screen. The American radar on the F-15 is the APG-63. We have the documentation, acquired from a source in Iran 3 years ago. It's a pulse Doppler system, high pulse repetition frequency, very capable, but it cannot see through a mountain range. Physics forbids it. Then the physics are wrong, or the manual is a fabrication, Arkady snapped. The investigation fractured into 3 alarming theories. Theory 1, the super missile. Design engineers proposed that the Americans had developed an entirely new class of missile, one with an active radar seeker far more powerful than anything known. If true, it would render every Soviet aircraft instantly obsolete. It implied a new era of fire-and-forget missiles, where pilots could launch and immediately retreat. Theory 2, the invisible aircraft. Some analysts theorized that the F-15s were merely bait. Maybe, they argued, the Americans were secretly testing a stealth aircraft, something undetectable, circling above and firing down on the MiGs. This theory gained traction. The Syrian pilot never saw anything because he had been looking at the F-15s below, not at a hidden executioner above. Theory 3, treason. The most politically dangerous theory was espionage. The Syrians are leaking flight paths. There is a mole in Damascus. The Israelis know our blind spots because someone gave them the maps. This accusation triggered a ruthless purge. Officers were interrogated, flight schedules were randomized, Soviet advisors seized absolute control over planning. Then they devised a test. They would send another MiG-25, but change every variable. Night launch, new ECM frequencies, a flight plan no insider could predict. 2 weeks later, the test began. A lone MiG-25 roared into the night sky from Tyus Air Base, climbing to 60,000 feet with engines glowing blue. Soviet advisors hovered over the radar screens, tense and silent. "Target Alpha airborne," the operator whispered. "Speed Mach 2.4. They waited for the Israeli reaction. With no spy tipping off the enemy, and with darkness masking the aircraft, response should have been delayed. Instead,
The reaction was instantaneous. "Contact, 2 bogies rising from the south, F-15s." The Soviets froze. The Israeli fighters were already in place, as if they had been waiting in total darkness for their arrival. "Jam them! Engage the siren jammer!" an advisor shouted. The MiG-25 activated its jamming pod, flooding the air with electronic noise. The F-15s should have been blinded. They weren't. The lock-on alarm, sharp, unmistakable, blared once again inside the Syrian pilot's headset. The ghost had returned. Panicking, the pilot abandoned the mission. He broke formation, dove, and fled back into Syrian airspace, shaken to his core. The test had failed. The spy theory was dead. The Israelis didn't need inside help. They possessed sensors that could see through darkness, through jamming, and seemingly through the earth itself. In Moscow, confusion curdled into dread. The Soviets realized they were fighting blind against a technology they couldn't even define. Was it satellite support, a new American computer breakthrough, something beyond their understanding? Rumors of the Golden Eagle, the F-15, grew to near-mythic proportions among Soviet pilots. They whispered that the Eagle's onboard computers could anticipate a MiG's path before the pilot even touched the controls. The Kremlin demanded answers. Billions of rubles were thrown at the problem. The MiG-25 was upgraded to the MiG-25 PD with improved radar and ER systems. Pilots were told, "The flaw is fixed, you are safe." But the engineers knew it was false reassurance. They hadn't fixed anything because they couldn't even identify what was broken. They were putting patches on an invisible wound. And while the Soviets hunted ghosts and interrogated innocent men in Damascus, the real source of their misery sat in a nondescript office in El Segundo, California, under the bright, smog-choked sunshine, celebrating.
Inside the spotless, climate-controlled labs of the Hughes Aircraft Company, there were no frantic officers, no shouting matches, and no interrogations, only the hum of mainframe computers and the quiet scratch of pencil on engineering paper. The people here wore short-sleeved shirts, glasses, and pocket protectors. They weren't soldiers. They were mathematicians and physicists, and they cracked the MiG-25 problem not with a more powerful engine, but with an equation. For decades, the Soviets had poured their energy into hardware. Their doctrine revolved around tangible superiority: thicker armor, bigger cannons, engines with more thrust. Their worldview was industrial. Victory belonged to the nation with the bigger hammer. The MiG-25 embodied that philosophy, an engineering brute, essentially a steel slab shoved through the sky by 2 volcanic jet engines. But the Americans had realized something the Soviets had never fully considered. The future of aerial combat would not be decided by raw speed. It would be decided by information. The weapon that was devastating the Soviet Air Force wasn't an invisible aircraft or a futuristic laser. It was a beige computer quietly sitting inside the nose of the F-15, the AN/APG-63 radar. To understand why this system was so revolutionary and so terrifying to Soviet analysts, you have to understand the enemy of radar operators: ground clutter. For years, radar suffered from a fatal limitation. It detected objects by bouncing radio waves off them. A high-altitude aircraft against an empty sky was easy to see. But when radar beams pointed down, those waves reflected off everything: mountain ridges, rooftops, trees, even cars on nearby roads. The result was chaos, a storm of useless signals. Finding a fighter jet in that noise was like trying to identify one snowflake in a blizzard. The Soviets counted on this weakness. It was baked into their survival playbook. Pilots were taught that the Earth itself was a shield. If radar painted you, dive low. Put terrain behind you.
The enemy's radar would choke on the clutter. The engineers at Hughes decided to erase the shield entirely. They applied the Doppler effect, the same principle that changes the pitch of a train whistle as it passes. The ground has a predictable relative velocity. A jet has a different one. If you could teach a radar to separate the two, you could see through the chaos. The APG-63 was the first radar in history with a programmable signal processor, a computer dedicated to filtering reality. It analyzed millions of radar returns bouncing off the ground and asked a single mathematical question: is this object moving at the same speed as the Earth? If yes, delete it. It performed this calculation thousands of times per second, wiping away mountains, buildings, and clutter. When an F-15 pilot looked at his scope, he didn't see terrain. He saw targets, nothing else. It was a near godlike power, a machine that could pierce the camouflage of the planet itself. This was true look-down, shoot-down capability. And it meant altitude no longer mattered. An F-15 cruising at 20,000 feet could track a MiG-25 at 65,000 feet just as easily as it could detect a MiG-21 hugging the ground. The radar saw everything. But detecting the enemy was only half the battle. The real miracle was hitting it. This led to the second American breakthrough, the snap-up calculation. The Soviets' physics were correct. Gravity punishes upward shots. A missile launched from 20,000 feet at a target near the edge of space burns fuel fast. By the time it reaches the rarefied stratosphere, it should be slow and easy to evade. But the F-15's fire control computer rewrote the engagement. Before the pilot squeezed the trigger, the system ran a real-time simulation. It calculated the speeds of both aircraft, air density, missile burn rate, and even the energy needed for a final turn. It told the pilot the exact moment to fire. It wasn't throwing a spear. It was sending a mathematically optimized trajectory upward, preserving maximum kinetic energy for the kill. The Soviets' analysts searched desperately for a hardware explanation, a bigger motor, a hotter fuel. They couldn't find one, because the missile hadn't physically changed. The secret was the brain behind it. The missile was the same spear. The computer had become the arm. But technology means nothing without the willingness to push it. And that's where the final component entered the story. The Americans built the weapon, but it was the Israelis who perfected it. When Israel received its first F-15s in 1976, designated Baz, their pilots, battle-hardened from the Yom Kippur War, ignored safety margins and factory recommendations. They flew to survive. They pushed the radar's limits. They rewrote software with American technicians. They wanted to know, how fast can we acquire a target? How far can we shoot? How small a contact can we detect? The cooperation was intense, discreet, and transformative. Israeli commanders, including the legendary Eitan Ben Eliyahu, studied Syrian flight routines obsessively. They understood the MiG-25 wasn't a fighter, it was a sprinter with one trick: speed. Chasing it was pointless. Racing it was hopeless. The F-15 didn't need to chase it at all. It needed to set a trap.
With the cold precision of a predator studying a migration pattern, Israeli analysts recognized the rhythm. The MiG-25 would accelerate, punch across the border, crack the sky with a sonic boom, and then retreat home. The Soviets counted on the enormous energy difference. By the time an Israeli interceptor launched and climbed, the Foxbat would already be gone. So the Israelis set out to eliminate that energy gap before the chase even began. They crafted a tactic built entirely on the APG-63's ability to detect targets without revealing its own presence. They exploited the very blind spots in the Soviet early warning radar, the same notches the Syrians and their Soviet advisors trusted for protection.
They placed their F-15s in what was essentially a hidden waiting room in the sky, patrolling just below the radar horizon of the Syrian network. It was like carving a hole in the heavens and hiding inside it. The plan required absolute discipline. Israeli pilots had to rely entirely on their computers. They had to fire missiles at targets they couldn't physically see, trusting nothing more than a glowing blip on their display and a tone in their headset. They had to believe that the algorithms written in El Segundo would stand up against Soviet brute force engineering. By early 1981, all the elements were in place. America had delivered the technology that revealed the invisible. Israel had designed the ambush. The Soviets, meanwhile, were still convinced they were fighting an electronic shouting match and were preparing with louder jammers, not realizing the war had shifted to silent, digital precision. They were bringing a megaphone to a chess tournament. The ultimate confrontation was inevitable. Soviet advisors were preparing to send their finest pilots in their fastest aircraft into a sky they believed was theirs. They were convinced the earlier loss was a statistical outlier. They were about to discover that in the age of microprocessors, flukes don't exist, only calculations. And the math for the MiG-25 had reached its terminal value, 0. The trap was set, and Israel was ready to send a message Moscow would not forget. By the summer of 1981, the uncertainty within the Soviet command had hardened into desperation. The February shootdown was still debated endlessly. Was it luck, pilot error, a 1,000,000-to-1 shot? The Soviet advisors in Syria needed a win to restore faith in the Foxbat, so they authorized an elaborate counter-ambush. This time, the MiG-25 wouldn't simply flee, it would lure the F-15s into a carefully chosen kill zone. Once the Israelis committed to pursuit, a second flight of MiGs from another vector would swoop in, trapping the F-15s at high speed and high altitude. They believed that if they could force the engagement on Soviet terms, fast, high, and brutal, the American advantage would evaporate. They still thought the battle was about aerodynamics, not algorithms. On July 29, 1981, they sprung the trap. Syrian radar operators watched the MiG-25 accelerate toward the border. As predicted, the F-15s rose to meet it. The geometry looked perfect for the Soviets. The F-15s were climbing steeply, losing speed. The MiG-25 was cruising overhead at Mach 2.4, secure in its kinetic dominance. "Now, engage," the Soviet advisor ordered. But the ambush never materialized because Israel had reversed the trap. The Israeli pilots, calmly reading their digital displays, ignored the decoy entirely. Their APG-63 had already identified the hidden second wave, long before the Soviet pilots realized they had been exposed. The F-15 simply shifted formation and locked onto the flankers. Warning alarms exploded inside Syrian cockpits. Panic set in. Their formation dissolved. Amid the chaos, another Sparrow rose skyward, this time not chasing the MiG-25, but intercepting it. The missile calculated where the MiG-25 would be, not where it was, and detonated. Another fireball. Another impossible hit. This time, there was no illusion of luck. The telemetry left no room for denial. In the same period, intelligence from KGB sources in the West reached Moscow, confirming the F-15's true capabilities. The report placed on Marshal Pavel Kutakov's desk delivered a single, chilling verdict. Look down, shoot down, capability confirmed. The shock was absolute. Soviet generals stared at diagrams of the APG-63's pulse Doppler modes and realized that for a decade they had been building a fleet of surface ships while the Americans had invented the submarine. "They can see us against the ground," a senior engineer said quietly. "The clutter notch no longer exists. Low-altitude attack is suicide. High-altitude flight is suicide. The Earth no longer protects us." The implications were staggering. Soviet homeland air defense depended on hiding among terrain echoes. Soviet strike doctrine relied on low-level penetration. The APG-63's computer had erased the entire Soviet tactical handbook with a few thousand lines of code. The reaction from Moscow was frantic and pointless. Upgrade everything, came the order. The MiG-25 PD was rushed into service with slightly improved radar and IR systems. Older fighters were refitted with new warning receivers. Training manuals were rewritten. Pilots were told to maneuver unpredictably, hoping to disrupt Doppler filters. It was like trying to plug holes in a sinking battleship with tape. The Soviet engineers understood the truth. To build a radar like the APG-63, they needed cutting-edge microprocessors. They needed a semiconductor industry to rival California. But the USSR had no Silicon Valley. They had factories that forged superb titanium, but could not produce precision microchips. They excelled at hardware, but were years behind in software. The futility became undeniable. Syrian pilots flying upgraded MiGs found the advantage negligible. The F-15s still detected them first, still fired first, still killed first. Soviet attempts to jam the APG-63 failed completely. The radar simply hopped frequencies, sidestepping jamming like a fast boxer slipping the punches of a slow, heavy opponent. By 1982, the verdict was clear. The MiG-25, the terror of the 1970s, had been effectively declawed. It was still the fastest aircraft on the planet, but now it was a blind sprinter in a sky filled with snipers.
The Israeli ambush was not only a tactical trap in the sky, it was a technological snare that cornered the entire Soviet military-industrial system in a race it was fundamentally incapable of winning. The Soviet leadership realized that the answer wasn't simply to build a better aircraft. They would need an entirely new, computer-driven economy, and time was something they no longer had. But the worst humiliation was still ahead. The Soviets had witnessed the loss of individual aircraft, the fallen trees, so to speak, but they were about to watch the entire forest catch fire. The Americans and Israelis were finished experimenting. Now they would showcase absolute dominance. If the February 1981 shoot-down served as a warning, then what happened in June 1982 was an execution. History remembers it as Operation Mole Cricket 19. To Israeli pilots, it became a shooting gallery. To Soviet advisors watching helplessly from the ground, it marked the end of an era. On June 9, 1982, the Israeli Defense Forces launched a massive coordinated offensive aimed at wiping out Syria's surface-to-air missile network in the Bekaa Valley. Syria scrambled every aircraft they had, MiG-21s, MiG-23s, even the prestigious MiG-25. It became the largest aerial battle since Korea. Soviet analysts anticipated a brutal dogfight, expecting a predictable exchange ratio, 3 or 4 Syrian jets lost for every Israeli jet shot down. Costly, but acceptable. But the F-15s, equipped with APG-63 radar and refined tactics born from years of shadow warfare, did not trade losses. They annihilated. The airspace over Lebanon turned into a slaughter. Israeli F-15s and F-16s, guided by E-2 Hawkeye AWACS and their own onboard computers, tore through Syrian formations with calculating precision. Syrian pilots, blinded by electronic interference and flying aircraft that could not pierce the digital fog, were killed before they even realized a battle had begun. By nightfall, the numbers reached Moscow and sickened everyone who read them. 29 Syrian aircraft shot down, 0 Israeli losses. By the end of the entire operation, the tally was even more devastating. 82 Syrian jets destroyed. Not a single Israeli aircraft lost in air-to-air combat. 82 to 0. That statistic detonated inside the Kremlin like a blast wave. It wasn't merely a defeat, it was a declaration that Soviet air power had become irrelevant. The Soviet deputy commander of the Air Force flew to Syria to investigate personally. He interrogated pilots, he studied the radar logs, he searched desperately for excuses, cowardice, incompetence, maintenance failures. He found none. What he found instead was the crushing realization that the technology gap was no longer a gap at all. It was a barricade. The legendary 82 to 0 record shattered decades of Soviet belief in quantity over quality. For generations, Soviet doctrine insisted that a jet was a jet and a tank was a tank. Mass would triumph. But the F-15 proved a single aircraft with advanced computing power could outperform 20 without it. This truth rippled from the military straight into the political heart of the USSR. If their best air defense technology, the same systems protecting Moscow, could be dismantled by Western electronics, then even their nuclear shield was vulnerable. If the Americans could track a MiG-25 against ground clutter, they could track a cruise missile, they could track a bomber. General Nikolai Ogarkov, the Soviet chief of staff, reviewed the carnage from the Baikal Valley and delivered a warning to the Politburo that chilled everyone in the room. He argued that advanced non-nuclear weapons built on electronics and information were now as decisive as nuclear arms themselves. He understood what others in the Kremlin refused to admit. The information age had arrived, and the Soviet Union, built on steel and coal, had been left behind. The legacy of the MiG-25 is a tragic one. It was a marvel of engineering, a breathtaking achievement of raw speed and industrial might. It still holds speed records today. Its existence even forced the Americans to build the F-15 in the first place. But in the end, it was a relic, a creature of the industrial era thrown into a digital battlefield. It was a knight in heavy plate armor charging into a machine gun nest. Magnificent, but doomed. The F-15, meanwhile, became the uncontested ruler of the skies. Its air-to-air combat record, 104 victories with 0 losses, remains unmatched. It never lost a dogfight. The phenomenon that mystified Soviet advisors in 1981, the ghost that saw through mountains and through the earth, became the technological blueprint for the next generation of fighter jets across the world. What Israel uncovered was not only a tactical trick, it exposed a lie, the belief that the Soviet Union was technologically equal to the West. When the smoke lifted above the Baikal Valley, the truth was visible to everyone. The West had transitioned to silicon, software, and sensor fusion. The East remained trapped in the age of rivets and brute force. Today, the surviving MiG-25s sit silent in museums and storage yards, their stainless steel shells faded and cold. They stand as monuments to a very specific fear, the fear of an enemy moving faster than you can think. But the true turning point of the Cold War wasn't the Berlin Wall in 1989. It happened 8 years earlier, inside a Syrian cockpit, when a pilot heard a tone he didn't understand and died to a missile he never saw. It happened when a Soviet advisor stared at a radar screen and watched a blip simply vanish, not because of sorcery, but because the Americans had taught a computer to interpret the world more clearly than any human ever could. The mystery was solved. The ghost had a name, and it wasn't magic. It was the future.